My name is Kentaro Toyama. I'm a faculty member at the School of Information at the University of Michigan, and I do research about digital technology and its impact on society. Overall, artificial intelligence is really any kind of system that is human created that does things that we as human beings perceive to be intelligent. In this broadest sense, it could be everything from the intelligent eye in your garage door opener that makes sure that the door doesn't accidentally shut on something. And of course, these days we are all carrying very intelligent things in our pockets. Our smartphones can understand our speech to a great extent and respond in an intelligent manner. All of that is artificial intelligence. But recently, there's been a lot of excitement around a particular class of artificial intelligence that is really about effectively a certain kind of very sophisticated kind of statistical pattern recognition and learning about patterns and generating new patterns and so forth. And that class, which is sometimes called neural networks or machine learning or deep learning, is really what's generating the recent excitement around AI. ChatGPT is one of the most recent technologies that have come out of this wave of AI. And what it is it's informally called a chatbot, meaning that you can have a conversation with it through a text interface, just like you were texting a friend. And what's amazing about ChatGPT is the degree to which its responses are so human in nature. In fact, unless you're really looking for flaws in ChatGPT, you can have a text-based conversation with it that just seems like you're talking to another adult human being. My name is Kentaro Toyama. I'm a faculty member at the School of Information at the University of Michigan, and I do research about digital technology and its impact on society. Overall, artificial intelligence is really any kind of system that is human created that does things that we as human beings perceive to be intelligent. In this broadest sense, it could be everything from the intelligent eye in your garage door opener that makes sure that the door doesn't accidentally shut on something. And of course, these days we are all carrying very intelligent things in our pockets. Our smartphones can understand our speech to a great extent and respond in an intelligent manner. All of that is artificial intelligence. But recently, there's been a lot of excitement around a particular class of artificial intelligence that is really about effectively a certain kind of very sophisticated kind of statistical pattern recognition and learning about patterns and generating new patterns and so forth. And that class, which is sometimes called neural networks or machine learning or deep learning, is really what's generating the recent excitement around AI. ChatGPT is one of the most recent technologies that have come out of this wave of AI. And what it is it's informally called a chatbot, meaning that you can have a conversation with it through a text interface, just like you were texting a friend. And what's amazing about ChatGPT is the degree to which its responses are so human in nature. In fact, unless you're really looking for flaws in ChatGPT, you can have a text-based conversation with it that just seems like you're talking to another adult human being.
My name is Joyce Chai. I'm a professor in the Computer Science and Engineering Division. I'm a member of Michigan AI Lab. I'm also Associate Director of the Michigan Institute of Data Science. So my research is in the area of natural language processing and artificial intelligence. And my recent work focuses on developing situated language understanding models and enable language communication with embodied AI agents. Generative AI is a new branch in AI, which is about models' ability to generate new content based on some kind of a textual input. So it can generate answers to a question, or generate image, or generate music, or generate programming languages such as code. So what enables this generative AI is the recent advances in foundation models. So such as large language models, ChatGPT, and models that generate language such as DALL-E. So these are the models that are trained based on huge amount of data, usually at the internet scale. So once these models are trained, they can be used for downstream tasks. In natural language processing, language modeling is used to refer to computational models that can be trained based on a corpora of text to predict the next word. So that is what language modeling is about. So for example, given a linguistic context, such as I went to a conference last, what would be the word following that last? It could be last week, last year, last May. There are many possibilities. So language model is used to predict what would be the most likely word following that word last. Large language models refer to the use of deep neural network to predict the next word. And these models are large in the sense that they have billions or hundreds of billions of parameters. And researchers use tons of textual data from the internet, such as like hundreds of billions of words to train these large models. Neural networks are inspired by human brains, which consist of billions of neurons. So these large language models also are made up of numerous nodes and their interactions. And the parameters of these models refer to the weights of those connections between the nodes. So when we say training the large language models, we're trying to get is the numerical values of these parameters that can make sure the models do a good job at certain tasks. So for example, when predicting the next word, what we have is this tons of this sentences, and we know exactly what the next word is. So this is actually really, really helpful because this gives us the supervision to train the language model, which is called self-supervision. So essentially, we want to train this model so that they can predict that next true word in the data. So by comparing the true next word and the model predict the next word, there is a mathematical procedure involved, which is called backpropagation, which essentially is to tune these models to improve its prediction. So you can imagine that these models, are trained for every word in the data, and at the end of a training, these models, this is called the pre-trained model. So you have these parameters tuned, and these models can be used for downstream tasks. So ChatGPT is made available by OpenAI. So these models, on top of the models that are trained based on predicting the next word, these models trained further by using instructional data. So this instructional data essentially just tells the model, given some kind of input, what should be the right kind of output. If you try ChatGPT on the OpenAI playground, and you'll notice that they ask you to give a thumb up or thumb down to the generated content. ChatGPT also uses this kind of a human feedback to fine-tune their model.
Yes, hello. My name is Matthias Campo. I'm an associate professor of architecture at Taubman College for Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan, and the director of the eerily laboratory, the Laboratory for Architecture and Artificial Intelligence at the university. So if you ask me how generative algorithms and generative AI works in the realm of art and architecture, then we have to go back and think a little bit that generative AI is not a completely new invention. There is a history behind it, and it also historically has been used by architects and artists. I can, for example, talk about the famous painting Edmond de Bellamy by the Paris-based group Obvious from 2018 that already used a generative AI tool to do it, until the newest iterations that we have seen of generative AI, like Midjourney and other image generators. So they're impacting both architecture and the arts in allowing to expand the possibilities of the artist beyond what we have in our own imagination, but basically expand the ideas, possibilities and concepts that we are allowed to use now through the use of generative AI. The difference between large language models and generative image models that are trained to create imagery or text, the basic idea behind it is not too different. You just have an enormous amount of data that you provide to a neural network that allows it to perform feature recognition and then allows it to construct images out of that learned features. So conceptually speaking, both things are very similar, no matter if it's language or images. In images, we're primarily working with the pixels in the images. If you have to think about the following. AI primarily works with numbers. So whatever we can transform into numbers, we can use in an artificial neural network. With pixels, that's the RGB values or grayscale values. In language, it's just the letters and sentences. So this allows us basically to perform these generative concepts. They all derived actually from another function. Originally, models were designed to do recognition or to do analysis. But when you start to reverse the flow of information, you go from analysis to generation. And that's what we're seeing currently with all these new tools that are popping up all over the place. The way that these new generative AI tools have impacted art and architecture, I would say that for architecture, it's always a bit too early to tell how it's really impacting the discipline, but we're really registering a higher frequency of calls and questions when I do lectures, for example, or when we publish papers and books about the ways that it will impact the discipline. I have no doubt it will do so because on the one side, similar to the arts, it allows the architect to expand the frame of possibilities. The design space that he's allowed to explore is just much bigger now through the use of AI, and we can go much faster through enormous amounts of data. So I would say that art and architecture might be a little bit different in the way how they approach their distinctive disciplines. In that architecture has very much a very specific functional task that it has to fulfill, versus arts doesn't necessarily have to do that. So it's much more free in exploring the tool in a more inventive way. Nonetheless, I think that the use of generative AI, what I can see right now is that it's absolutely inspiring architects in terms of thinking beyond what the discipline currently can do and explore spaces that were previously maybe unobtainable to us because it needed so much data to be explored. So in short, what we're seeing right now is actually just the emergence of this use of these new tool sets. We see already possible ways to apply that to large-scale construction and large-scale design ideas. At the same time, it allows us also the architecture discipline to explore the entire history, so to speak, because it has to obtain first, of course, the data of this long history to do something for the future. And I think it's similar for the arts. In the arts, I see many new artists coming up who are basically able to extract this enormous amount of artistic history behind the work of today and being able to somehow translate that and project it into a possible future artistic tendency.
I'm Michael Wellman. I'm professor and chair of computer science and engineering at the University of Michigan. I'm a researcher in artificial intelligence, have been for many years. My work studies the intersection of economics and AI, both how AI can use economic principles, as well as understanding the use of AI in economic contexts and the economic impacts of AI. We're all primed to assess the quality of a knowledge product, a document, some text, based on how professionally it is prepared, how smooth and fluent it is, if it's the language, how coherent, how on point to the context. Because ChatGPT-3 has provided a apparent leap in the ability of automatic AI generation of text to achieve those, achieve very good coherence and fluency, we are likely to perceive it as accurate and reliable based on these our standard way of making those judgments. Those ways of making judgments have been sound in a world where creation of coherent and fluent and educated text requires big investments in time, in education, in research. When it can be done cheaply by an AI, however, that equation is upended, and we may no longer have that correlation between the apparent smoothness and fluency, et cetera, of text and its reliability and accuracy. Businesses, organizations, individuals that have a reputation that they're trying to protect may be wary of putting out lots of material using ChatGPT or similar technologies that they cannot be sure of the accuracy or quality of it. In fact, reputation, I think, is one of the best mechanisms we have for keeping abuses in check. What we have to worry about more is entities that don't have reputations, anonymous attackers, trolls, third parties that we're not really sure where the material came from. They don't have any reputation to lose, and they're more likely to try to avail themselves of these methods to achieve their aims. What this, I think, also means is that we may need to invest more in technology infrastructure for tracking the provenance, certify the sources of materials so that we can be sure that it's tied to an entity that has a reputation, that has a stake in maintaining that reputation, and not one just representing that the source came from something that they're claiming is credible. Well, I think these days one has to be really careful and wary of any information that one meets out on the internet or from any source that you're not sure where it came from, because it may be artificially created either maliciously in order to mislead, or just by methods that are not reliably accurate. Either one can have bad consequences, and so it does mean you need to take things with a grain of salt, and we have to all adjust our filters a little bit.
I'm Rada Mihalcha. I'm a professor of computer science and also director of the Artificial Intelligence Lab here at the University of Michigan. I work in natural language processing, which is an area in artificial intelligence, and I've been working in this field for about 25 years. The technology behind ChatGPT is technology that has been in use in natural language processing since pretty much the beginning of the field. And by this I mean language models, which are some of the core models in NLP. And so I'm familiar with the technology behind ChatGPT, including language models, which I just mentioned, also supervised learning, using human-like instruction. With ChatGPT itself, my familiarity is since about December, which is pretty much everyone else's familiarity. In terms of how ChatGPT produces output, this is a big leap forward compared to previous technologies. The fact that it consistently produces text that is very coherent and looks very much like human-produced text. And so that means many different things in terms of applicability. It opened the doors to a lot of applications that could use human-like language, which can span different disciplines in education, for instance, in healthcare, in many social interactions. So a lot of different applications where we use language, we could think of now using this AI-generated text. And so there is a lot of different applications that we could now consider as possible. I believe the other implication is also in terms of sort of the other side of the coin. The fact that it does look so much like human, we'll now start wondering whether some piece of text has been produced by a human or by an AI. And I think this also has a number of implications. The fact that we now are not sure anymore what's the source and whether it's human vetted or there are multiple maybe groups of humans that are behind a particular piece of information, or is AI produced. And I can also talk more at length about the factuality or lack of factuality, which is still very much a characteristic of this AI language. Well, I think this, in terms of being aware that ChatGPT is ultimately just a system, there are multiple angles to it. One is the users themselves. I think it's our responsibility ultimately to remind ourselves that this is not a human, both in terms of capabilities and what it can do, but also in terms of how we interact with such tools. Then there is also, I think, a responsibility in terms of institutions that make available such tools, also in terms of governments. I believe regulation is now very important with respect to what can and cannot be done with these tools. I would think even very simple things like a disclaimer that would state that, for instance, this site uses an automated system to interact with people, or the fact that an article has been written with support from something like ChatGPT or other similar systems. I think this kind of transparency is very important, because otherwise I could see how there will be a lot of information that will be shared online that we would not know the source necessarily. And so that will start being misleading. And people will very quickly lose trust in what information they see. And generally trust is hard to regain. So it's, to make this short, it's both in terms of users, just reminding ourselves that we interact with a system ultimately, and also those who make this available, institutions and higher level governments alike. There is truth bias, which is something that's human nature to primarily tend to believe what we hear. And without speculating too much, it is a part of survival, so we need this in order to navigate the world. Now we've seen that misinformation can in fact affect truth bias. So just with the human-produced misinformation that we currently see online, there is a lot of lack of trust in what we see. Like myself, I wonder wherever I see or hear a news piece, whether it's really true or not. And I believe without having correct boundaries in place, that could be really increasing with this AI-generated, whether it's language or images. And so it goes back to what I was saying before, that both reminding ourselves that even if it looks very confident and it looks very human-like, it doesn't necessarily mean correct. And also for those who make available such tools, I think it's people's responsibility, if you put out a piece of text, whether you wrote it or something else wrote it, like an AI, to make sure that you check what's in that text. Now, at some point, this may be wishful thinking. So I think continuing to be very critical of what we see rather than believing what we see, and even if it's embedded in something that looks very coherent, so there might be an entire article which all looks correct, and it looks, again, very confident, which is the style of this AI-generated language, still thinking that maybe down the page there is one sentence which is completely incorrect, which currently is possible. So there are many such statements where maybe 90% is correct, but there is a 10% which is not. So being critical of the entire piece as opposed to just taking a look, looks good, and then just go with it.
What generative AI systems are good at is generating whatever it is, whether it's text or music or images, that is in some sense statistically like the data that it was trained on. And since most of the data that we train these systems on is generated by people, they're basically very good at generating human-like content. Now, the crux is in what it means to be human-like. They don't actually generate things that actual professional human beings would generate. And in fact, one of the things that a lot of generative AI systems are not very good at is being logically consistent or being very precise about the content that they produce. So, for example, ChatGPT, which produces, basically is an AI chatbot. One of the things that it routinely gets wrong, even now with ChatGPT 4, the latest incarnation of it, is multiplying large numbers, right? So, for example, multiplying 4-digit numbers, it doesn't do consistently right. I just tried it right now, and in fact, it will often get the answers wrong multiple times in multiple different ways, even after you've challenged it to with the actual correct answer and so on. And multiplication is arguably a very simple arithmetic operation. There's lots of other examples of logic that it gets wrong and so on. With respect to imagery, there are systems where, for example, everything looks just like something that somebody might draw, but maybe like the earrings on the left and the right side don't look the same. And this is all because the current generation of AI systems is not necessarily built with logical accuracy as a intended feature. And in fact, I would say that what's more surprising is that these systems get any aspect of the logic right at all. And I think that speaks to the strength of the systems and what they're actually able to learn, even when certain things aren't explicitly built in. In fact, among AI specialists, there's a kind of an ongoing debate about whether or not logic needs to be explicitly built in, or whether or not if you give a system enough training data and tweak some of the algorithms, that maybe logic will automatically be learned from the data. I happen to be in the camp that believes you need to build in the logic explicitly, but we'll see what happens.
So interactions with these systems are primarily through prompting. Some people would also refer to it as prompt engineering. And if we were to use a machine to write such prompts, ideally you would write a number of them, you would also paraphrase them, and then send them all to something like ChatGPT, and then see which one gives you the best response. So a lot of the work that is done in prompt engineering, mostly from a technical perspective, would use that kind of strategy. Now, for people, we cannot really write 100 prompts and see what comes best in response to those prompts, but we can still leverage that kind of idea and write prompts and then adjust them based on what we get back. In terms of general guidelines, you would want to have a prompt that indicates what you want back, right? So maybe you will want a paragraph about, say, climate change, right? So you will want to indicate that. You will also want to indicate what kind of style you want, given that these systems can in fact produce different styles. So you want something formal, or you want something persuasive, or you want something in, say, third person singular. And then you can also provide indication of context. Like, for instance, this is for a larger article on climate change, and you need this one particular paragraph that talks about maybe heat waves. And with that, then you can adjust. You see what comes back. ChatGPT has, in the interaction, you will have a way to regenerate the text. So if you don't like it, it will produce another one. Usually they are very similar to each other, so you really don't get that much variation just by regenerating. And instead, you can try to put another prompt, like maybe try to change the style, or maybe try to change the request. Or maybe even provide, if, for instance, there are multiple pieces of information that you already have available, maybe from things that were produced, you can ask it to summarize that. And so see how, in which ways you could get a condensed information from the sources that you already have. So at this point, it's a lot of trial and error. Also because these models are very large, so not even the people who build them could exactly predict what will produce. So it's prompt engineering that you try and see what comes back. And also because the systems will change periodically. So for instance, the interactions we'll have with ChatGPT now might be different from what we had a month ago and from what we'll have a month from now. And so that's why thinking of how to interact, it's useful. Overthinking might not be that useful, because even if you get the best strategy now, it might not necessarily be applicable tomorrow. Good versus bad prompts, well, go back to this idea of trial and error, which we do well also when we search online. So we have something in mind that we want to find, and we'll put it in a Google search or Bing search or any other search engine and see what comes back. And then based on what comes back, we may adjust our query and try again. And so if it's an input that is too vague, then what you get back will be similarly vague. If it's too specific, you might not get back what you would expect. Now with something like ChatGPT, it's similar to some extent. So if it's too broad, it will produce something very broad. If it's too specific, it might take a path that is not related to really what you wanted. I believe from my experience so far is that it always tries to produce something. So even if you go very specific, like maybe you give names and you give very clear specification as to what you want, it will try to produce something, but it might be completely different than what you had in mind. So there is that adjustment to find the sweet spot. And also the language should be relatively generic, because that seems that would work best. In technical terms would be, and that's what is done when you try to find the ideal prompts automatically, you will want those that would have the lowest perplexity with respect to the model, meaning that they are the easiest understood by the model. And so that's also the distinction between good and bad. You will want the kind of language that will be most closely aligned to the language model.
I'm H.B. Jagadish. I'm a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Michigan, and I direct the Michigan Institute for Data Science. My area of expertise is responsible data science and the ethics of artificial intelligence. I have been studying this topic for several years, and I have a massive open online course in MOOC on this topic that I invite you to explore. Today, we're going to talk about generative AI and the ways in which one should or could use these responsibly, and the ethical issues, or some of the ethical issues that it raises. And before we dive into it, I want to spend just a minute or two on some background as level setting. So we're going to take several steps back and talk about machine learning, which is the key part of AI that we are interested in and that has had the biggest impact on society. The idea here is to have a machine that's a computer look at data. This is technically called training data, and to train itself to find patterns in the data based on which it learns to do whatever it's supposed to learn, such as scoring something or predicting something. And so based on training data that it has studied, it may learn some patterns and be able to predict whether it'll rain tomorrow. And if it's done a good job of this learning, and if the data that it's learning from actually has this kind of predictive value, it might actually be able to tell us with reasonable correctness whether it'll rain tomorrow. This kind of thing has been very useful, and this has been how AI has been used for the most part in the past several years in so many different aspects of our society. A really exciting new thing that has happened over the past year or so in particular is the success of something called generative AI, which has the same basic structure as what we've been talking about. So a generative AI system also learns from training data, but now the patterns that it's learning are not trying to predict something simple like whether it'll rain tomorrow or not. Instead, what it's trying to do is to generate content that it thinks would make sense in the context of the training data that it has seen. So this context could be text, statements, paragraphs, poems, whatever. Or it could be other types of output, paintings, music, computer programming code. This kind of generation of high quality output is something that has really amazed everyone in the past year or so, and is the reason why people are so excited about generative AI.
I'm Jack Bernard, and I'm an attorney in the General Counsel's office here at the University of Michigan. I also teach in our schools of law, education, public policy, and information. And I have been thinking about ChatGPT since I first heard about it, which is, I guess, about 8 months ago. And I've responded to lots of questions from people in our community about how it works and what kinds of implications it creates. Well, I mean, I think you don't have to plagiarize when you're using ChatGPT or any other kind of AI that's out there. I think the opportunities with these kinds of technologies are amazing for us. I mean, there are a tremendous number of things that people might be able to do with these kinds of AI technologies that don't involve any kind of academic misconduct or misrepresentation of any kind. That's to say, we use technology all the time when we're doing our work. The challenge with these kinds of AI technologies is that they're able to do a lot of the work for us. And because they do a lot of the work for us, it might be tempting to want to use them in ways without giving them credit or without acknowledging that we didn't do that work. And of course, in the academy, the coin of the realm is acknowledgement and credit. And we might struggle with this new technology because the lines are right now unclear. So for instance, we have students who might go to a friend and say, hey, could you just read this paragraph for me and give me a sense about whether it makes sense to you? Well, we don't typically acknowledge that kind of support. And now lots of students use technologies like the recommendations in the Word software or Grammarly. And I think those kinds of things don't get acknowledged. Of course, those sorts of things aren't capable of writing an entire paper or an entire response to a question. And so I think people are apprehensive about the possibility of replacing a student's or even a faculty member's own thinking with the product of something like ChatGPT. So I do think there are lots of ways to use ChatGPT and other AI technologies without engaging in some kind of plagiarism, but I don't think that it's hard to slip into the world where someone might have plagiarized. It's easy when you've run out of time to lean on another source, because we already know our students do that, right? They go to Wikipedia or they go to someone else's article and just cut bits of it and put it into their own work without acknowledging it. It's worth also saying something about what is plagiarism. Plagiarism is not a legal violation. It's a violation of academic norms. So when someone plagiarizes, they don't acknowledge the source of specific language or even of their thinking, or they attribute it to somebody else, like adding someone else's name to your paper in order perhaps to attract more readers. And I don't think it's necessary when using technologies like ChatGPT to keep those things hidden. In fact, I expect that students will say, I created this paper and I used ChatGPT to help me. That's a possibility. How faculty will respond to that, that's a whole new question. I think just because ChatGPT looks across a large corpus of information to produce an individualized, independent response to a query that draws on this experience that it's had reading lots of other materials, that doesn't make it plagiarism, in the same way that it doesn't make it plagiarism for me to have formulated all these words that I'm producing right now from all of my experiences over a lifetime. And so I think ChatGPT is doing essentially what people do, maybe not exactly the same way, but in ways that are actually very similar, which is it accumulates knowledge and assembles a perspective based on the AI. Now, it probably isn't conscious just yet, but it's a lot like going to somebody else who also does the same thing to get information. So I don't think it's necessarily, it's not plagiarism on the part of ChatGPT to create new expression from being exposed to lots of things. It is possible, I suppose, for ChatGPT to quote a third party without someone knowing about it. And I guess in that case, it could be plagiarism. But I think it's unlikely to be the case. From what I can tell, there's some safeguards there. There are probably safeguards that can be circumvented in some way or another. We have yet to see. But for the most part, just assembling an amalgam of this information it's been exposed to and creating original expression, that in itself is not plagiarism. That's just communication from a piece of technology. I think it's difficult to know what kinds of citation culture we're going to create around these smart technologies, these AI technologies. Right now, we don't know what to do. I think students, faculty, publishers are going to be a little confused about how to acknowledge whether their materials were created in part with a collaboration with some kind of AI. I don't think we know the answer to that question yet. If it were me, I would err on the side of letting people know that this is what I used, because I think it's about integrity. We want, in the academy in particular, to make sure that we're citing our sources. And so I think students and faculty should make their best efforts to create normative standards where there are expectations about what people can and cannot use. And of course, in some classrooms, faculty members will be using ChatGPT as part of the teaching model. And so I think maybe that will be baked in and a student wouldn't have to mention it because it's part of the original assignment. But I think if a student or a faculty member, say when making a publication, were using ChatGPT, it's a good idea to acknowledge it, especially in these early stages, because I think it provokes conversations that will enable us to think about what our culture around citing AI will be. Yeah, so who owns the ChatGPT output is an interesting and somewhat open question. I mean, from a copyright perspective, right now in US copyright law, anything that's not created by a person can't get copyright protection. So it's not clear that there's a copyright ownership of what ChatGPT produces. Of course, the ChatGPT software, the copyright is held by OpenAI. And that's true for any of the other AI software programs that are out there, the ones that create art or music or any number of other things. Those people who created their code actually get to hold the copyright in the code. But the output, it's different. It just is different because the Copyright Office won't recognize it as a copyrightable work if the work is authored by a non-human. One of the challenges I think that we face in plumbing this particular set of depths is that how will we know what portions of a work were created by the AI and what portions were created by a person? That's very difficult to know. Right now, if I put paint on the paws of a cat and I let that cat scratch away at a canvas, if it's the cat that did the work, well, then there'll be no copyright in that. But if I don't say that it was the cat that did that, and I pretend that I painted it, I'm not sure how the U.S. Copyright Office would know whether or not that was a copyrightable work. So this is a challenge for us. In terms of monetizing what's created through ChatGPT, I'm not aware that there's any prohibition on using the materials that ChatGPT has created. Actually, it would be worth looking at the terms of service because they may prohibit it. OpenAI will absolutely find a way to monetize this. They have investors. Microsoft has invested in them already to the tune of billions of dollars. So there is no question they will find a market for monetizing this to generate revenue. Whether I will be able to monetize the output, it's hard to say. In playing with these technologies, and I've played with several technologies, they create things that are unique and interesting, things you might want to know. Like, for instance, I asked ChatGPT the other day to write an additional chapter to Tolkien's The Hobbit, the chapter that takes place after the last chapter, after Bilbo has come home, and between the time that he's returned home and the time that Gandalf comes back to visit him years later. I wanted to know what happened in the ensuing years. And it created a wonderful narrative in the style of Tolkien, because I said, do this in the style of Tolkien. And so that was interesting. What are the ethical issues with respect to monetizing the output of ChatGPT? I think in general, we need to cite our sources. We need to acknowledge our sources. And so there's the risk that somebody isn't doing that. That is, that they're taking stuff that's produced by ChatGPT, pretending that they were the author of that work, and then putting it out there. Now, it's not necessarily unlawful to do that. We'll have to see how the law plays out in this area. I imagine there's going to be a whole lot of development and potentially panic around these issues. But there certainly are these kinds of integrity issues and authenticity of the work created. We always worry about that. In some ways, going to ChatGPT is a lot like going to somebody else. It can produce information in the same way that other humans can produce that information, and in a way that looks an awful lot like what humans might say, or in the case of the art AI, what humans might produce on their own. And so the idea of giving people credit or fame or opportunity or access as a result of what they've produced that actually was produced by AI, I think that raises some concerns for us as a society, and it's something that we ought to be thinking about. But I'm not sure the sky is falling. In the same way that there are ghost writers and ghost painters and ideas spring forth from the individuals we talk to, and we don't necessarily even remember where we got that great idea. What's interesting about ChatGPT is it really doesn't come up with ideas on its own, but maybe neither do we.
The thing that one worries about with respect to any AI system, and certainly for generative AI systems, is bias. For the most part, this bias arises because there is bias in the training data on which the system has been trained. So the first thing to think about is, where did this training data come from? The training data is usually collected, often at great cost, and may come from a variety of sources. At the end of the day, we may end up training a system on the data that we've been able to get our hands on, even though we know that it's not a perfect reflection of the world that we would like to model. And there's a lot of satisficing and saying, oh, this is about as close as we can get to with respect to the data that we have. Everybody understands that it is important to have training data that is representative of the world that we're trying to model, and that if we don't, then we are likely to end up training a system to behave in ways that would be perceived as incorrect or at least biased. And so people building these systems do make an effort within the constraints of what data they're able to collect to do the best job they can. Nevertheless, there are any number of stories that people can tell about how many AI systems have failed in this regard. It is generally believed that if the teams that were building AI systems were more diverse, that there would be fewer errors. And I think that's a reasonable statement. Just because with a diverse team, people who think differently, there's less likelihood of some types of mistakes going unnoticed. It is also generally believed that in addition to engineers who would be building these systems, that it is a good thing to have processes for consultation with communities that are impacted, just in terms of making sure that we're covering blind spots and making sure that the kinds of concerns about certain data sets or known biases and ways in which certain data sets were collected can be recognized and addressed ahead of time. None of this is a magic pill that's going to make training data unbiased. Even with the most diverse team and even with great community consultation, it is quite possible that we end up with training data that isn't really representative of what it is that we want to do. There are many reasons for this. Representation is tricky. To be able to say, I've got a data set that is representative, I need to be able to first say what it means to be representative. If you and I don't even agree on what population it is that we're trying to represent, well, our notions of representative couldn't be the same. So, for example, a hospital trying to run some kind of clinical trial might want to have good representation with respect to its catchment area and the kinds of patients that might live in that area. But then they might wish to publish a paper about the results of their clinical trial that would impact the whole world. And even if they'd done a perfect job of representing their patient population in their study, that doesn't mean that they did a good job of representing the whole world. In fact, they almost certainly didn't. And so here we have this thing of what is this model going to be used for and what does it mean to be representative? So answering these kinds of fundamental questions is hard. Now, in the case of generative AI, these problems might actually be slightly easier because we have to assume that generative AI systems are universal and are meant to be universal. At least that's how they seem to be today. And so we want to represent everybody on Earth. The next problem with representation has to do with the fact that there is a lot of evil in the world. There's also a lot of false statements that people make. There are certainly lots of false statements on the web. and lots of people who have a vested interest in promoting these false statements. If we say we want to be representative, well, we probably want to be representative of things that are incorrect and things that are malicious, just as much as we are representative of all that is true and all that is good. Well, we might say, but we really don't want to have evil stuff in our system. And perhaps we could build filters to take out things that are evil or things that are not true. And the problem here is that it isn't so easy to define filtering criteria. There might be things that we universally agree are evil, but there are lots of things that reasonable people disagree about with regard to whether they're evil or not. Certainly, there are lots of things that reasonable people disagree about the veracity of. And so, yes, to some extent, one might be able to fix the most egregious things, but a lot of these things are not so easy to fix. Another issue with representation is different points of view are not equally represented, or for that matter, different races or ethnicities are not equally represented in terms of the population of people or in terms of statements on the web or whatever is the universe that we're building our data sets from. Now, what this means is that small minorities might actually get ignored because what they say or do or the way they behave is very limited or has very limited support as a standard pattern in the data set. And so proportionate representation is insufficient if we care about small minorities in our population. And so we actually need to overrepresent them in our training data or overweight them in our pattern learning if we're going to be truly inclusive and truly able to manage the correct amount of diversity that we have in the world. Everything that I said about representation applies irrespective of the type of data. It applies whether the data we're dealing with are numbers that we're getting from measurements that we made, or we're getting them from text statements that people had, say on social media, or whether we get them from images that we scraped from the web. There might be some minor differences in the details of exactly how we define representation or how we measure what is being represented and so on. But at the basic level that we are discussing these issues right now, they apply equally to text, images, numbers, and whatever other type of data you can imagine are being used as training data in the AI systems that we built.
I'm not sure how AI technology right now can engage in discrimination. We just don't think of discrimination that way. That doesn't mean that people won't be offended. But the AI itself probably isn't discriminating the way a person might discriminate. It is true that AI could be influenced by the discrimination that's replete in society, the bigotry that exists in society, the perspectives of society. Those things will infuse AI technologies that use as a source of their thinking the expressions of human beings. I mean, human beings are filled with all kinds of biases, and while they're filled with great beauty, they're also filled with an enormous amount of ugliness. Well, the bot that's scraping all of this information will pull that information in too, and has the capacity to express things that may be upsetting to people. The modes, the kinds of feelings, I just don't think they have those sorts of feelings of animus, at least yet. It's not clear to me that the AI technology has reached the state of consciousness yet. That may happen. I don't know if it's possible to happen. There's no reason to believe, by the way, that consciousness can only exist in entities made of meat. It's certainly possible, it strikes me, that consciousness could arise in other kinds of assemblages of chemicals and atoms. And so maybe one day there will be smart AI that actually is capable of thinking in ways that are much more like what we're doing, or maybe even more advanced than what we're capable of doing. I just don't think we're there yet. But those bigotries that exist in our culture, if they're infused into the background of what those technologies use, it's likely that we'll see those kinds of impressions expressed by those technologies. I suppose another two ways I can think of where we might see discrimination exist is maybe the entities that make ChatGPT or other kinds of AI available won't put them into a format that's accessible to people who have disabilities. That means that some people who are members of society won't be able to get the benefit of these technologies, and that would be a shame. It's also possible that people won't be able to have access because they can't afford access. That is, there's an enormous amount of investment in these kinds of technologies, and if they're not available to the general public, well, then only some people will have the advantage of labor-saving technologies like smart AI. I think if we're not careful, there will be the haves and the have-nots, and again, society is discrimination, where some people in some constituencies are more or less likely to have resources. This may perpetuate the kinds of discrimination that already exist in society. So if someone were to feel discriminated against by the AI, I'm not sure there is a legal recourse. They can raise a concern. They can express themselves. I'm not sure that the courts are the solution to that problem. I actually think raising consciousness, speaking up about it, expressing concern, sharing information with the general public about that experience is a great strategy. And communicating with the companies that create those technologies and letting them know, this was the experience that I had when I interacted with your software in this way. I think for the most part, there's been an effort on the part of at least some of these AI companies to have their technologies not perpetuate biased stereotypes, but that doesn't mean that they won't seep through, and I think they would welcome that feedback, since that's what they're trying to avoid, making a much more welcoming environment for people to use those technologies. I think there are a variety of issues related to privacy with these kinds of AI technologies, because people, I think, will be tempted to do some work saving by introducing information in their queries, say to something like ChatGPT. And in that information, they might include information that ordinarily they would think of as private, not realizing that when you put that into the software, you may be exposing information you aren't supposed to expose. So for instance, instead of saying the name and medical information of a patient, in order to get ChatGPT to write a letter or to make a note describing what your experiences were with that patient, a doctor might want to not use the name of the patient when making that description. But as we habituate using these technologies, people may not be thinking, right? They may not be put in mind of the ordinary precautions that we take in the context of sharing information, just because it feels so private when you're at home, alone, engaging with a machine. It doesn't feel like that information will necessarily spread. So I think people should be cautious about the information they provide, even if they want assistance from entities like ChatGPT or any of the other AI bots that are out there. It's fantastically helpful, I think, to use those technologies, but you just may not want to include information that would ordinarily be private. Yeah, I think it's safe to ask sensitive questions. I just think it's important to leave out information that will be absorbed into the database of the technologies that you're using. If you were able to give a lot of information about an identifiable person, you could have that information infused into the background data from which the AI draws information. And that might include a photograph, or it might include music that someone else had written, or it might include descriptions of an individual. And so I think you want to be careful about sharing that kind of information, because you don't know how it will be used and whether or not that information can be exposed. So I do think it's important to use those technologies with the idea that you may be exposing information you ordinarily wouldn't want to expose. At the same time, I think you can talk about very sensitive issues without exposing that information. You can create pseudonyms for individuals if you need to talk about an individual name. You can put it in the context of fiction if you want to. You could interact in a way that's cautious and still talk about subjects that are controversial, difficult. I actually can see AI technology making some kinds of conversations a lot easier for people, particularly sensitive conversations, because some people might be more comfortable and more honest if they're engaging with a piece of technology rather than another human being. I think there are a lot of introverts in the world out there who might find that more comfortable. And maybe not just introverts. It could be anybody who's just more comfortable engaging with a piece of technology in the same way that they might talk to their dog, their baby, or their plant. I'm not sure what the companies like OpenAI can do to protect private information from being exposed through the AI. I'm not sure that there's going to be an easy way to recognize fact from fiction. That is, I'm not sure that they will be able to determine whether the name that someone inputs when they're trying to have another chapter of a book written, whether that person will be seen as identifiable. It's possible if someone says, okay, ChatGPT, I'd like you to write a piece of fiction, and then that fiction will forever be, that notion of fiction will forever be tied to the characters that follow. It's not clear to me whether that's possible or not. Maybe it is. And I'm not sure how they will do that. What they've done already is amazing. I mean, the idea that the experience that one has when interacting with these technologies is to produce something that a person could produce, or to produce something that seems like a conversation. These are amazing things. So I don't want to say that it's impossible to be able to winnow out the fact from the fiction, but I think it will be difficult. So I'm not sure what they'll be able to do.
Fundamentally, the idea of generative AI is to make up things. The idea is to generate things, to generate novel and interesting content. The thing is, if you're generating content that's novel and interesting, you also need to know that the novel and interesting things that you're generating are not falsehoods. So here's this thing. We as humans understand when somebody's telling a story that it's a story. It's not the truth. It's fiction. On the other hand, when somebody is writing a scholarly article and says, here's my citation, that had better not be fiction. That had better be an actual reference to an actual scholarly writing that's being cited. That is a distinction that generative AI doesn't know how to make, at least today. This is perhaps the most talked about limitation of generative AI systems today. The technical term for these kinds of made up things that generative AI creates is hallucinations. Generative AI systems today are full of hallucinations, and they're stated in very convincing language. And you will not get cues from the system that suggest a lack of certainty or the kind of thing where my facial expression gives it away when I'm unsure or hamming it up or saying something that is not true. This is a current problem. I expect technical solutions will be found. This will be reduced in the future. But as of today, this is a very significant problem that has to be taken into account when somebody uses a generative AI system. A deeper problem, going back to what I was saying earlier about the fundamental nature of humans finding well-argued statements in fluent language more believable than other kinds of statements, is that generative AI systems are capable of very fluently presenting to us information that is fake. In other words, if somebody wants to use a GAI system intentionally to mislead us or to believe or to make us believe something that isn't true, they've got the tools to do that because that is what a GAI system is good at. This is a much deeper and more fundamental problem than the problem of inadvertent hallucinations.
My name is Scott Page. I'm a professor of management and complex systems here at the University of Michigan. And I work on collective intelligence. So how is it that groups of people, and now groups of people and algorithms, are sort of better at solving problems, making predictions, coming up with creative ideas than someone would be on their own. And so the thing that I find fascinating about ChatGPT-3 and these other forms of AI is they've got a lot of ability. They're really good at doing a lot of things. But the things they're good at are different than the things humans are good at. And so that potential, that combination of ability and diversity, portends really good things for society, in my opinion. So the study of technology and breakthroughs and how they spread across society is something that economists and sociologists and business school professors have been studying for well over 100 years, beginning with some studies of seed corn. So when you had hybrid corn, people in Iowa were using it, and then it was working really well, somebody else copies it. So what you get is you get almost always an S-shaped curve, where early on there's a set of kind of like mavens or promoters who do it. Everybody else kind of sees them being more productive. They copy them, so it takes off really, really fast, and eventually it sort of flattens out. What's interesting as well, though, is in that first sort of kink, when it really starts to take off, there's maybe a little too much optimism. So Roy Amara, who started the Institute for the Futures, sort of says, there's almost too much optimism at first, but then there's too little optimism about the long-term impact. And the reason why is if you look at how these things play out, initially, people use the new technology to do what we're currently doing, maybe a little bit better. So people are using ChatGPT to write things for them, right, to do coding for them. So things they were already doing, they're like, wow, I can do this faster. And that's how it sort of takes off. Then what happens is people realize, wait, I can do these other things that I couldn't do before, like possibly synthesize all of my notes, or like Firefly is this software that you can use that I can record meeting notes and then search past meetings. So people start seeing new functionalities that they didn't expect. And then eventually what will happen is society will reorganize itself in structural ways around this new technology. So if you think of the move from the horse to the car, you have all sorts of industries, like the whole resort industry, hotels, all those things sprung up when we moved from the horse to the car. And so will this cause a fundamental restructuring of society? Maybe not the physical world, right? But certainly the world of information, the world of work, the types of jobs people have are going to get restructured. So you're already seeing a lot of advertisements on LinkedIn and Upwork for people who do what they call prompt engineering, which is essentially like, using these software programs to solve problems, to gather information, to write reports. And so we're going to see the S-shaped curve. The beginning of this curve is faster than anything we've ever seen before, right? In 5 days, you had 1 million people on this software program, right? It took things like Netflix 2.5 years to get that far, right? It took Facebook, I think 12 months to get that far. So this is just unbelievably fast. I guess as this rolls out and it's rolling out so fast, I think one thing we want to think about is this being different from other technological innovations we've seen is that it's free. So the analogy I use all the time when discussing this, in public groups is to think about it as though the government pulled up in front of everyone's house with a pod that had a full wood shop in it, bandsaw, lathe, table saw, and they gave you an unlimited supply of wood. And they just said, go for it. Do whatever you want to do. Make whatever you want to make. And so we've created this kind of maker space in a way where people can do art, music, poetry. You can write anything you want. You can, create documents. You can create just, web pages, blogs. It's just a million flowers blooming. Some of them aren't going to be very beautiful. Some may be quite remarkable. And so we don't know what's going to happen here because this isn't like the light bulb or the car. Like the car, there was a high cost of entry, right? You couldn't just go buy a car. But this is, everybody has access if you want. And people who have access to technology have access, and that is one issue here. But the people who do have access, which is a lot of us, I think it's going to be kind of mysterious and wonderful to see how it plays out. I think it's also incumbent upon us to make sure that everyone does have access. And so particularly like in the education realm, we know that like children, young people are given a new space, given a set of Legos, they can do amazing things. So this is this kind of virtual set of Legos with an assistant, and we'll see what happens. Right now, it's Legos with no instructions, right? There's no 120-page instruction sheet with it. And so we'll see what they do. But I think it's really important we push it out to young people because they're going to do amazing stuff.
The effect on human capital will be very much affected by the balance of the substitute and complement effects. To the extent that the AI can do exactly what a human creative knowledge worker could do before, that may have some displacement, or it may shift the kinds of tasks that the human does versus what the AI does. To the extent that they're complementary, it can really amplify the effects of the content creator. One creative activity that's close to home in my area is computer programming. I'm a professor of computer science. We educate software engineers, and of course that is a really thriving area of knowledge work and is often very creative. ChatGPT can be applied to programming, and there's also related technologies like GitHub Copilot, which has been out there for a while, that similarly uses machine learning to study a lot of code and be able to generate code in response to prompts. And we see that many software engineers find that quite useful, not to totally replace what they do, at least not to this point, but as an amplifier. It helps them quickly come up with draft solutions to the tasks they face, and may ultimately improve their productivity and the quality that they produce. It changes what they do. They may have to come up with new skills to know how to work well with the AI. So I think it poses new questions, actually for us as educators as well. How do we train knowledge workers to work in tandem with AI technologies in creative processes? I think that's something that we don't really know how to do very well yet. So we're going to be learning that and developing the pedagogy around that as well.
My name is Kurt Skivstad. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Michigan. I hold a PhD in artificial intelligence from the University of Michigan, and I have over 30 years experience in commercializing new technology, including technology coming out of the AI lab. And I'm teaching a new class on the business of AI. So what is prompt engineering? Prompt engineering, you think it's prompt authoring. How do you generate strings of text or music or imagery that go into these systems to feed the outputs that you want? And these systems have unique characteristics and behaviors that will change with the way you structure the input to them. And that's an expertise that will definitely evolve over the next months and years. What's interesting here is you look at new technologies generate new opportunities in the workforce, and you look at the rise of the internet. We can think of search engine optimization as a role that didn't exist 25 years ago, but now is fundamental to any web-facing business. What's going to be interesting with prompt engineering is to understand whether that evolves into a discipline and expertise in and of itself, like search engine optimization, or it becomes something that we all know, like how to use a Google search engine. Searching on the internet wasn't something we did 25 years ago, but it's something we all do very comfortably today. And so prompt engineering, it will be fascinating to see if that evolves into a specific expertise that becomes a new role in the organizations of the future. Yeah, when looking at how generative AI will impact different parts of the economy, it's really interesting to see how big it's gotten so quickly. ChatGPT was released in November of 22, and we're already looking at projected revenues of almost 3.7 billion in this calendar year, growing tenfold over the next 5 years. As an information technology, there's really three ways you can see people doing business around these things. One is providing the technology as a service. You've heard software as a service. We're now hearing model as a service from these big providers of these solutions. The second way is looking at new novel applications based on this technology, and this is perhaps the most interesting area for me as entrepreneurs find new ways to do business based on these tools. And you can think of personal assistants or tools for your company to automatically manage their social media streams based on this technology. And then the third way is vertical integration. So you have existing software solutions out there that are managing information streams, whether it's in the design space or the information space, and these tools will be added on as additional capabilities. Think of Photoshop with the ability to do generative AI to fill in parts of an image based on a text prompt. Yeah, when thinking about opportunities for industries to take advantage of this technology, obviously, as an information system, these are tools that will make sense in information industries, whether it's content creation or content management. You see these tools naturally slotting into existing workflows, whether it's document management or content creation for artists or marketing organizations. I think the challenge is understanding where is the data that feeds these systems within your value chain. And that's where the opportunity lies as well. Do you have unique business assets that can be used to train these systems to create unique incremental value for your company or for your customers? And then within that, the challenge is managing the provenance of these data so that you can know that you have proprietary rights to leverage them for new incremental value delivery. Yeah, when looking at generative AI through the lens of a business owner or an aspiring entrepreneur, I think it comes down to first the data. Data is the coin of the realm with this new technology, and the data is what you will use to create value out of the large language model. And look within your organization to see what assets you have and what might be used to create a generative AI solution to create incremental value for you within your operations or for your customers. For entrepreneurs, this is an exciting new time, and trying to understand where business is going to be with generative AI and what are the opportunities that will be afforded by that. It's, as Wayne Gretzky says, skate to where the puck's going to be. What are the business trends and how is doing business going to change, and what new opportunities exist because of that? You can look at new assets that you might be able to, digital assets you might be able to get access to as an entrepreneur, or you may look at process expertise or connecting the dots between previously disconnected workflows in the enterprise and monetize those. Or you can go back to the old adage, in a gold rush, be the one who sells picks and shovels. Because there's going to be a lot of needs for picks and shovels in this new world. Figuring out what that means in the age of generative AI is a great place to look. Yeah, for aspiring entrepreneurs in this space, the opportunity is to look at what data assets you can get access to that will create unique value around your area of expertise or your unique ability to bring data together to train these systems to create outputs that you can monetize. When attempting to commercialize generative AI, I see four main challenges for businesses. One is scale. These systems are very, very large. They require a tremendous amount of data, and they require a tremendous amount of compute power to create the models from the data. There's a recent article published saying there's a underclass in Africa being employed at the rate of $10 a day to annotate videos to train autonomous driving systems. And this is only going to continue with the demands of these systems. So the scale of these systems is problematic. The second main challenge with these systems is the intellectual property associated with these massive data sets. Given their massive scope, it's very challenging to understand the provenance of every piece of information that's fed into these systems. There was recently a lawsuit by a couple of authors who claimed their books were included in the crawls used to create some of these new commercial models that are out. And it's going to be really difficult to understand whether the books were actually included or perhaps there was a blog post that was Creative Commons license that was used in the crawl, and there's going to be lots of challenges in adjudicating that. The third main challenge is understanding the validity of the output of these systems. These systems are very, very good at creating compelling textual responses that are contextually appropriate and sound very compelling, but it's very hard to determine whether the outputs are actually true. And we hear of cases where the systems are hallucinating and making up new connections or new thoughts or new bits of information that aren't actually validated fact. And then the fourth challenge, which is a new one where I'm seeing more and more discussion around, is the actual depth of understanding these systems have. Fortunately, most of human communication is pretty superficial, and so that's why these systems are going to be very, very good for a lot of interesting applications. But for detailed applications, say in a medical environment where you're using a chat tool to onboard a new patient, you need to make sure the information they're managing is absolutely correct and goes as deep as it needs to. And so there are going to be some unique challenges associated with depth of understanding with these systems. When you think of use cases that are particularly interesting, I think the low-hanging fruit here is things like personal assistance. Having a generative AI tool who understands my email history and can help me schedule meetings and help me respond to basic emails and manage my day-to-day life is going to be very compelling. Other things like managing social media is a no-brainer, and in document-heavy professions like the legal industry. I was speaking with a lawyer yesterday, and this world is going to change completely. These tools are incredibly effective at summarizing existing documents, and will be very, very useful in creating new workflows in those worlds. Sitting in my chair at the Center for Entrepreneurship, the advice that I give people who come and ask about this new exciting space is it's really about coming back to customer needs and markets. It's easy to get excited about the shiny new technology, and believe me, I'm very excited about this, but commercial success comes back to solving needs that a market has and alleviating customer pain. And so thinking in terms of what customer pains can be alleviated or addressed with this technology is where you want to start. The tools are moving very quickly, staying on top of the trends and understanding and extrapolating to what that's going to mean for your area of expertise or the market you're interested in is going to be critical. but it always comes back to solving a defined need for a customer and not getting lost in the exciting parts of a new technology that are so compelling.
So my first reaction when I saw ChatGPT was that it's really great that we see all this progress. I'll have to also say there was the first time when I really saw major progress in terms of what this kind of language models can do. It's not the first time that language models have been used at very large scale. There were other previous models, but I think the output now, given that it's not only the language model, but it's also some human supervision, the output is really human-like. And so it now opened the doors to so many social applications. And my first thought was, well, now this is great. People will not spend that much time just building language models and fine-tuning them and tweaking parameters. It really frees all this time for a lot of researchers to really spend time on social impact. Now, whether that will happen, we'll have to see. But in terms of applications, for instance, in education, we keep talking about how important it is to have personalized education. Now, is that possible? So for the Teach Out, for instance, to what extent is personalized? There are hundreds or thousands of students, and it's still me just talking in just one way. Right? When you have a tool like this that can take a piece of information and personalize it or match it to one's background, it's very impactful. It can be very impactful. So I believe this is just one example, like personalized education. Because we now have such powerful tools, we can now really start thinking about that. So even if I have a class, like the class that I teach here this semester, 250 students, I could possibly think of creating materials that are adjusted to the level of knowledge of each student, which as an individual, I definitely cannot do that. But if I'm augmented with the power of these models, I could start thinking on how to do that. And there are many other ways. As a student, I could imagine not overusing it, because then it might discourage me from learning, but I could imagine almost like a private tutor, right? So if I learn a language, I could ask for things. It will not necessarily be ChatGPT out of the box. It might need adjustments or a model like that, but then adjust it to, say, language learning. It could help me in ways that maybe a native speaker would help me, like interact with me, have a dialogue, maybe correct me when I say something wrong. Many other areas, like in healthcare, for instance, in terms of making information that exists already online, but making it available in a way that's more accessible to people. Like there is information, for instance, which is in more like doctor language, which is hard to understand. So putting that in simpler language that I would understand as somebody not trained in the medical space. Or even, ChatGPT, for instance, is not necessarily intended to be available in multiple languages. It makes some attempts. It doesn't always succeed. But I could see technologies that make use a lot of language in many different languages, how being available, having applications available in multiple languages will again open the door to a lot of things, which we now maybe have available for a handful of languages, like it could be question answering, or it could be summarization, or it could be generating questions or finding keywords, whatever you would think of. And now having those available in all the other languages of the world will really could be a major shift for a lot of people. Now again, what I was saying earlier, it's really a question to what extent people will start devoting attention to that. We could just stick with something like ChatGPT, a handful of languages, and just keep going forward with that. Or we could now, because we have the ability with tools like this, to also think on how we can broaden it up.